The 2024 college football season was a disappointment for a lot of different people, a lot of different programs, for a lot of different reasons. And I think you start at the top of the disappointment rankings in 2024 with two SEC schools for somewhat different reasons. I think Georgia and Ole Miss lead off the teams and the programs that had disappointing 2024s. Because for one, Georgia is in the current mode of their fan base, their program, etc. Everybody involved in Georgia football believes that they should be a national championship caliber team year in, year out right now. And they were not that in 2024. I don't think they were close to being a national championship caliber team in 2024. And when you're confronted with that after being kind of the 10,000-pound gorilla on the block for quite a while, it's a difficult thing to have to confront and deal with. But Georgia had really high aspirations coming into the 2024 season and didn't meet those expectations. They just didn't get there. There was talk that Carson Beck could be the number one overall pick in the NFL draft. And now there's talk if Carson Beck's going to go in the first 2 days of the NFL draft when he comes out after he transfers to Miami. And I recognize that all of the things that could go wrong for Georgia at times did, especially at the quarterback position where a guy that you expected to play really well just flat out didn't play really well. And so that's why I think Georgia leads this list of teams who were really disappointing in 2024. And that might even just be somewhat hindsight about how their bowl game against Notre Dame went. But they lost to an Alabama team that wasn't a typical Alabama team over the course of the last almost 20 years. They lost to a Notre Dame team that was good and really hot at the right time. And so I don't know that you can hold a stupid amount of what went wrong for Georgia wholly against them to the point where you're questioning, what does the future mean for the Dogs? I don't think I'm in that situation or scenario just quite yet. I just think that when you look at what the expectations were, not only from the greater college football world, but for themselves, I think that there was the expectation that Georgia might be the team to beat in 2024. And I don't think that they were, the is juggernaut that you expected them to be in 2024. They lost 3 games, and things got off to a really good start when they beat just the hell out of Clemson. But they lost Alabama. They should have lost, and I generally don't do should have lost, but they should have lost to Kentucky. They got just beat down by Ole Miss, lost to Notre Dame. It just was not the year that you expect Georgia to have compared to what the last couple of years have been like for them. Now, speaking of Ole Miss, I think Ole Miss is in this conversation as well. That Ole Miss thought a 12-team playoff is 1,000% going to include Ole Miss. And when you see now everything again in hindsight of, okay, this is a football team that viewed themselves as we are going to be a playoff team, a playoff contender, and then didn't get in due to really no fault of anybody else's but their own. Ole Miss was kind of the poster child for bitching about not making the college football playoff when your kind of biggest selling point, your biggest resume builder was, we beat Georgia, who we just told you was maybe the most disappointing team in college football in 2024. So Ole Miss, like Georgia, had 3 losses. They had a bad loss to Kentucky. They lost to LSU, who did not have a great season. And now there are questions of hey, wait a second, is Brian Kelly the right guy for the job? They lost to Florida, a team that they had no business losing to. Ole Miss felt like, and for a lot of people, a lot of pundits coming into the season, they were a lock. It was like Ole Miss is a foregone conclusion of a team who is going to make the college football playoff. And they did not get there. Somewhat like Georgia, Ole Miss had an experienced quarterback that they felt they could rely on to play really well and lead them to the CFP. And he didn't. He didn't get there. And so now the question remains of like, oh, if not now, when for Ole Miss? Because Alabama is in a time of transition. LSU has not been up to what their expectations have been necessarily under Brian Kelly. Georgia was just the most disappointing team in college football. If not now, when will Ole Miss ever take that jump and be a really successful team and program in the SEC? I don't think you'll like the answer to that question if you're a fan of the Rebs. I don't think that you are going to want to have to deal with the fact of like, okay, we had a really good quarterback. We had everything kind of stacked for us, and our losses end up being to a Florida team who barely makes a bowl game and a Kentucky team who couldn't throw the forward pass was what held us away from playing in the college football playoff. Now, you can hang your hat on, like, we kicked the hell out of Duke at a bowl game. Congratulations. It's the signature win, maybe, for the SEC in the postseason. But if that's the highlight, if like, hey, and it's probably not the highlight, beating Georgia is probably the highlight. But congratulations, your highlight is you beat the most disappointing team in college football. Way to go. Now, I think there are two other teams who aren't as disappointing, and maybe their 2024 becomes less disappointing depending on what happens in 2025. But there were two teams in America's heartland that moved on from starting quarterbacks that went on to have really good seasons. Kansas State chose Avery Johnson as their quarterback over Will Howard. Will Howard transferred to Ohio State and won the national championship game. And Avery Johnson didn't play so incredibly well that Kansas State was on the cusp of making the college football playoff. Now, if 2025 goes better, you can count off and you can write off 2024 as like, you know what? We let that season be a learning curve for our young quarterback with the idea that 2025 is going to be our year. And if 2025 becomes Kansas State's year, then 2024 becomes less disappointing. But on the surface right now, and I've made this case before, that I think Kansas State and also Oklahoma, who's in a similar boat where they had Dylan Gabriel, let him go for Jackson Arnold, and Dylan Gabriel goes to Oregon as a Heisman Trophy finalist, the number one team in the country, the only undefeated team through the conference championship weekend. And Oklahoma struggles, and Jackson Arnold doesn't even finish the season as their starting quarterback. You're in a rock and a hard place. You can keep the established wily veteran who probably doesn't have a strong NFL future, and I don't think Will Howard or Dylan Gabriel have really strong NFL futures. Now, I don't know that Jackson Arnold and Avery Johnson have them either. But you can take your old established wily veteran who can be viewed as a game manager or somebody who's not going to win you the game, but they're also not going to lose you the game. Or you can choose the young, unproven, athletic as all get out, untested option and have to make that decision. I don't think it's a great spot to be in, but both of them chose, because the alternative is Avery Johnson and Jackson Arnold transfer out of your program, and then you have to start over at that position again. And if there's a position in college football you don't want to have to start over in, it's at quarterback. They were forced into making a difficult decision. Now, I don't think you can call either one of them the right decision or the wrong decision, because I'm here to tell you Will Howard probably doesn't lead Kansas State to the national championship. He is greatly helped by a really good offensive line, really good wide receivers, maybe the best running back room in the country, a great defense, elite coaches. All of those things coincide with him leading a team to the national championship. He didn't drive it there. He was along for the ride, and that's okay. And Dylan Gabriel didn't necessarily drive Oregon to an undefeated record in a Rose Bowl appearance. He was along for the ride, and that's okay. But the options are you ride those guys, and your young up-and-coming, super talented but unproven quarterbacks transfer out and probably go star somewhere else, or you take your lumps in 2024, which Oklahoma definitely did and Kansas State did to a lesser degree. But it's still a disappointing season when you watch the people leave your program that you chose to let walk go have really successful seasons. I don't know how you view that anything other than a really disappointing 2024, but that can be lessened by what happens in 2025. For Ole Miss and Georgia, I don't think that's the case. Jackson Dart and Carson Beck are people and players you invested in, and it did not pay off for you. You didn't get a great return on your investment, and they're now gone. And now Ole Miss and Georgia are in similar spots of we are going to have different quarterbacks in 2025. And when the expectation is having continuity at that position leads to success, there are other ways to success, but like one of the most surefire ways is to have an established quarterback that you already know their strengths, weaknesses, know your system, what the expectations are, etc. And you're starting over from scratch at that position, not a great spot to be in. So I think it's just as likely perhaps that 2025 is another disappointing season for Georgia when the expectation is we have a national championship caliber roster. Or at Ole Miss, it's likely that 2025 is another disappointing season when the expectation is we should be competing for college football playoff spots. I think that's easier said than done for Lane Kiffin's squad. But I want to know your thoughts. Who did you think was the most disappointing teams in college football in 2024? Would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you get all the great college football content we're pumping out. If you're listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. I'll see you tomorrow for another episode of the Daily Huddle.